Welcome back, brothers and sisters, as we continue our journey through the book of John, and today we're in John chapter 3 verse 12, which I've titled, Look to Christ and not to ourselves. Jesus said, If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I told you heavenly things? It should have been easy for Nicodemus and the others to believe this testimony regarding the new birth brought by the Spirit, for this belongs to the lesser parts of divine revelation, to the basics of the gospel. The more significant is the guilt for not believing. Far more significant and higher things are included in the gospel and must also be told and testified. If the lesser are met with unbelief, what will happen in the case of the most significant? If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how, if I shall tell you heavenly things, shall you believe? Here Jesus confronts the how of Nicodemus with the how of his own. For Nicodemus, the answer is always ready. For that of Jesus, none exists. Now Jesus omits reference to the Baptist and speaks of himself alone. Hence, we have the singular in the verb forms. Therefore, it does not imply that we need to press the point to shut out the Baptist from knowing any heavenly things or anything about them. He had the measure of revelation that he needed regarding these things. Nevertheless, he could not testify to them as one who had directly seen them, as in verse 13 and chapter 1 verse 18. We now have the plurals in Greek, I have told, and if I tell you, which of course are not generally all earthly and all heavenly things, but specific, those about the kingdom. Nor are the earthly and the heavenly opposites, but are most intimately related, are actually correlatives. The kingdom has an earthly and a heavenly side. The earthly side has an exalted heavenly background. To the earthly belongs the contrition and faith and repentance, baptism and regeneration, the many things of like nature. If these are to be fully and properly understood and received, the heavenly must be added. Those things which occurred in heaven in order to establish the kingdom on earth, the counsel of God's love for our salvation, the sending of the Son and the Spirit, and all this not merely for the consummation of the kingdom, but equally for its establishment, progress, and continuance to the end. The first condition of reality, if I told you and you do not believe, it expresses what a fact is. The second is a condition of expectancy. If I shall tell you, how shall you believe? Jesus expects and reckons with this future unbelief. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to think that Jesus admits some justification for unbelief in the heavenly things. Or, to put it another way, he would be more readily excuse this unbelief. The how of Jesus is not measuring degrees of guilt. It's not justifying or excusing unbelief, but is reckoning with the likelihood of faith with this, or that the content of the gospel for men who, like Nicodemus, meet already the earthly things of the gospel with their how of unbelief. The contrast between the earthly things and the heavenly things is difficult to fathom. Some take the earthly things to refer to physical elements such as wind and a natural birth, while heavenly things refer to the new birth. However, no one disbelieves that earthly things such as wind and physical birth. A subtler variation of the same interpretation takes earthly things to refer to birth and the blowing of the wind. but takes the clause, "and you do not believe," to mean that you do not trust and recognize God in these events, nor see how they point parabolically to the birth from above. Hence this seems an extraordinary generous periphrasis. It is also tangential to the context, for natural birth and the blowing of the wind do not function in the narrative as the appropriate objects of faith to gain spiritual insight, but illustrations or analogies of spiritual realities. On its face, the obvious candidate for earthly things is the new birth itself, the subject of Jesus' conversation so far. Some reject this interpretation because the birth of water and the Spirit is from above, so it can scarcely be considered as earthly thing. Nevertheless, it is earthly because it takes place here on earth when people are born again. More importantly, Jesus' teaching on the new birth is elementary. If Nicodemus had apocalyptic leanings, he might have wanted to know what the new heavens and the new earth would be like, and what God's kingdom would be like when it finally dawned. As in Isaiah 65 verse 17, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind." Jesus says, in effect, that entrance into the kingdom depends absolutely on the new birth. If Nicodemus stumbles over this elementary point of entry, then what is the use of going into to explain more of the details of life in the kingdom? The heavenly things are then the splendors of the consummated kingdom, and what it means to live under such glorious and ineffable rule. This verse speaks volumes about the nature of the church today. However, this is no different from the church yesterday. The only problem is that our days are narrowing down, and soon the tribulation shall begin, and many souls will be lost because we refuse to accept the nature of our being. The issue begins within us, and our inability to come to terms with our continued disregard for God's teachings. Jesus would not have come if there was any possibility for humanity to set aside our reasonings and self and turn to God. The reality of our broken state continues in many who claim salvation. Unfortunately, the reality of the condemnation is apparent, since their views are so blinded by their self-righteousness that we cannot see our own faults. It begins with us, and that battle does not end in a moment's acceptance of Christ. The battle against ourself continues till judgment. Unless that truth is made known, we will continue to live in a lie. Thank you, and God bless.